Tonight begins with a strike that Western intelligence officials are describing as unprecedented, possibly the most psychologically devastating operation Ukraine has carried out in the entire 3A. Our war, it was not aimed at a military base, not at an ammunition depot, not at a command center. What happened 48 hours ago was something very different. It was a message, delivered with precision and intent, sent straight into the heart of the system Vladimir Putin has spent decades building. The Kremlin had publicly warned that crossing this particular line would bring catastrophic retaliation. That line was crossed, and instead of fury, Moscow responded with silence, a complete and unsettling silence. Ukrainian forces carried out a precision strike that landed within striking distance of Putin's personal Black Sea palace, the billion-dollar compound that symbolizes everything he has accumulated, everything he has hidden, and everything he is most afraid of losing. Tonight, we can now piece together what happened, why it happened, and why Western intelligence believes this moment could alter the direction of the war. This is the story of how Ukraine brought the war directly to Putin's doorstep. Picture the scene in the early hours of the morning, at 3:47 a.m. local time, on a moonless night along Russia's Black Sea coast. Inside a heavily fortified compound near Gelenchik, security teams monitor a wall of screens tracking the surrounding airspace. The estate is vast, sprawling across nearly 18,000 square meters of some of the most tightly protected land in the country. It includes vineyards, a private theater, even an underground hockey rink, all hidden behind layers of secrecy and defense. Responsibility for keeping this place untouchable rests with the most powerful figures in Russia's security apparatus. General Viktor Atsilov, commander of the aerospace forces, oversees the air defense shield. Admiral Alexander Moiseev, head of the Black Sea Fleet, provides naval surveillance and early warning, and Dmitry Kokhnov, director of the Federal Protective Service, commands the agents tasked with guarding Putin's personal properties. These men control billions of dollars worth of defensive systems. Their careers and their loyalty rest on a single promise: nothing gets through. But that night, something did. Ukrainian drones began slipping into Russian airspace. Not recklessly, but methodically. They were probing response times, mapping radar coverage, and exposing gaps in a defense network that was supposed to be impenetrable. Deep inside command rooms in Moscow, operators watched as the system was tested in real time, and for the first time, the illusion of absolute control began to fracture. They tracked the incoming threats, and one by one, a realization set in that was far more unsettling than any conventional attack. These drones were not moving toward military bases or critical infrastructure. They were heading straight toward the most heavily protected private residence in the Russian Federation, and the systems designed to make that scenario impossible, the S-400 air defenses, the Pantsir batteries, the electronic warfare layers, all failed to stop it. Multiple projectiles landed inside the security perimeter of Putin's personal compound. That fact alone changes everything. For more than 18 months, there had been quiet signals, not official statements or diplomatic warnings, but subtle indications that Ukraine was preparing something entirely different. Ukrainian operations have always been aggressive, but they have also been disciplined and deliberate. Their strikes followed a recognizable logic, almost a doctrine, carefully calibrated to achieve results without triggering uncontrollable escalation. What alarmed intelligence officials in Washington and London this month was that this pattern suddenly disappeared. Analysts who track Ukrainian military planning know the signs. Long-range drone units began moving in unusual ways. Electronic warfare assets were quietly repositioned. Communication channels that normally showed constant activity went silent. Specialized operators were recalled from other fronts. When Ukrainian command goes operationally quiet like that, it signals that something major is being prepared. What we are witnessing now is a shift in the targeting calculus that had held for 2 years. Until now, Ukraine avoided direct strikes on assets tied personally to Russian leadership. It preserved plausible deniability on the most provocative actions and reassured Western allies who feared escalation. That restraint has eroded. Patience in QIV has run out. Western limitations have loosened. Ukrainian capabilities have expanded. When military planners reach the conclusion that following old rules leads only to slow defeat, continued territorial loss, and an eventual forced settlement, doctrines begin to collapse. That is when red lines are crossed. Ukrainian leadership made a deliberate decision. If Putin could believe that his personal world was untouchable while Ukrainian cities burned night after night, that imbalance had to end. The psychological sanctuary he relied on, the belief that the war would never truly reach him, needed to be broken. On that night along the Black Sea coast, it was. And to understand why Pentagon analysts immediately recognized this as a strategic turning point, we need to look closely at what happened next. Through satellite imagery and signals intelligence gathered in the 72 hours that followed, Ukraine carried out a coordinated drone swarm involving an estimated 12 to 15 long-range unmanned aircraft, combining modified Mugen 5 platforms with domestically produced systems designed for a single purpose: to overwhelm Russian air defenses. The goal was not precision through a single strike, but saturation, flooding radar screens, exhausting interceptors, and ensuring that at least some of the drones would reach their destination. Executing an operation like this required extremely precise intelligence, the kind that only comes from long-term reconnaissance. Ukrainian planners had to know where radar coverage thinned, how electronic warfare could briefly blind early warning systems, and how to program flight paths that exploited known weaknesses in S-400 tracking algorithms. The level of real-time coordination involved strongly suggests advanced intelligence sharing at a depth rarely acknowledged publicly. What makes this even more significant is who authorized it. The successor to General Valery Zelensky, a commander known for operational caution, approved the strike with full awareness of its implications. Ukrainian leadership understood that this meant directly threatening Putin's personal property, that Moscow would interpret it as an operation bordering on assassination, and that several rungs of the escalation ladder were being skipped in a single move. This was not an accident, and it was not miscalculation. It was deliberate. When Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov was later asked about reports of explosions along the Black Sea coast, his evasive response only underscored the gravity of what had happened. These were not harassment attacks or symbolic gestures. They were systematic degradation operations, the kind Ukraine deploys only when it intends to exploit a demonstrated weakness. Intelligence confirmed that Ukrainian forces followed up by striking air defense batteries across the Crimean Peninsula, including systems that had been hurriedly repositioned to protect the Black Sea coast after the Palace incident. Ukraine moved faster than Russia could adapt. Radar installations were hit. Command nodes were disrupted. Ammunition depots supplying coastal defense systems were targeted. In effect, Ukraine attacked the very infrastructure meant to prevent a repeat of the Palace strike. That is why Washington's assessment carried so much weight. This operation was not just psychological, it was operational. It demonstrated a capability that, if left unaddressed, could force Russia to rethink how it protects its leadership, its territory, and its critical assets. Moscow understood this immediately. And yet, instead of responding with strength or clarity, the Kremlin went quiet. There was no dramatic retaliation, no unveiling of new weapons, no decisive escalation. Instead, there was hesitation, uncertainty, and a hurried reshuffling of defensive assets, a reaction that revealed far more than any public statement ever could. They launched internal investigations. Quiet inquiries replaced loud threats. The dog that was supposed to bite never barked. And this is where the story becomes even more consequential. Intelligence analysts now believe that the strike near Putin's palace was deliberately designed to test the credibility of Russian deterrence after months of increasingly hollow escalation warnings. KYV wanted to see whether Moscow would follow through on its promised catastrophic retaliation, whether Western allies would rush to condemn the operation, and whether Putin's so-called red line still carried any real meaning. Instead, the opposite happened. Russia did not unleash vengeance. Its response was so restrained, so hesitant, that even pro-war Russian military bloggers voiced open frustration. You do not capture the Kremlin's attention by playing it safe. This week, Ukraine did something different, and the most important impact of this operation may be psychological, especially for Putin himself. He has built his entire political identity around the image of being untouchable, unpredictable, and capable of projecting power everywhere while remaining personally insulated from consequence. His war effort depends on that image of invulnerability. This strike cut directly into it. Putin cannot publicly acknowledge what happened without admitting that his defenses failed, but he also cannot truly ignore it, because his own security services know they failed, and they know that he knows. That contradiction places Putin in a psychological trap. He is caught between admitting vulnerability and pretending nothing happened at all, combined with internal blame-shifting among security agencies and growing resentment within the military command. This creates the conditions for increasingly erratic decision-making at the top. Defense analysts speaking anonymously to multiple outlets describe Putin's position as cornered. A mental state that historically leads either to retreat or to dangerous overreaction. At the same time, Ukraine demonstrated something equally important. They showed not just capability, but confidence. Their operations were not isolated successes. They were sequenced with precision, with follow-up strikes exploiting the exact defensive weaknesses revealed by the initial operation. That level of coordination signals strategic maturity. Ukraine is no longer simply reacting to Russian moves. They are shaping the battlefield and dictating tempo, even striking near the most sensitive symbols of Russian power. To understand why analysts see this as a potential turning point, it helps to look at history. Psychological inflection points often matter more than physical damage. One of the closest parallels is the Doolittle raid of April 1942. When American bombers struck Tokyo just months after Pearl Harbor, the physical destruction was limited. A handful of bombs on the Japanese mainland, but the psychological shock was profound, shattering the illusion of invulnerability and forcing a fundamental reassessment of defense and strategy. It showed that Japan's defensive perimeter was not impenetrable. It forced a massive reallocation of resources toward homeland defense and contributed directly to strategic overreach at Midway. That raid succeeded not through overwhelming force, but through audacity and meticulous planning, where a small number of aircraft produced effects far greater than their actual military power. The result was a psychological shift that influenced Japanese decision-making for months. Another powerful parallel comes from 1987, when a teenage German pilot named Matthias Rust flew a small Cessna and landed it in Red Square, just steps from the Kremlin walls. There was no real physical threat, just one amateur pilot in a light aircraft. But the political and psychological impact was enormous. The Soviet defense minister was fired almost immediately. Hundreds of air defense officers were dismissed or disciplined. The incident exposed a widening gap between the Soviet Union's claims of military capability and the reality on the ground, accelerating the erosion of institutional credibility that preceded the collapse of the USSR. Putin's Russia is now approaching a similar moment. The visible collapse has not happened yet, but the warning signs that precede such collapses are clearly present and accelerating. Tonight, one reality stands out unmistakably. Ukraine has demonstrated that it can strike anywhere inside Russia. Russian air defenses have been exposed as insufficient. Putin's red lines have been revealed as hollow. And for the first time since this war began, Vladimir Putin appears genuinely unsettled. The Kremlin is quiet, almost unnervingly so. And when Moscow falls this silent, it usually means calculations are underway, assumptions are being re-examined, and preparations are being made. Because tonight, Putin learned something he never wanted to know. His palace is not untouchable. His threats are not absolute. And the war he unleashed is no longer confined to distant battlefields. It is moving closer to home. This story is far from finished. We will be watching closely as the next phase unfolds. Thank you for being here. Stay informed and good night.